Welcome to Dipu Kader Stories. They thought she was just another woman who didn't know her place. They saw a black woman sitting quietly on her own porch and decided she needed to be taught a lesson. They were the HOA, the self-proclaimed kings of a tiny, perfect kingdom called Liberty Crossing. The man in charge, Richard Sterling, believed his rules were more important than the United States Constitution. So when this woman refused to be intimidated, he gave an order. His men put her in handcuffs on her own property for the crime of being calm, confident, and unapologetically successful. What they didn't know was that this woman was General Anita Shaw, a 30-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force, a strategic genius known as the Architect, and the cheap plastic cuffs they snapped on her wrists. They had just triggered a silent, high-level alarm straight to the Pentagon. What happens when a petty tyrant handcuffs a national asset? Stay with us to find out. The shattered calm. What brings a woman to her knees on her own front porch on a Saturday blessed with sunshine? A woman who once commanded the skies, who had advised presidents in windowless rooms where the fate of nations was weighed. What brings a woman like that to the cold, hard flagstone? Her hands bound behind her back like a common criminal. The hands were rough, unpracticed, not the hands of law enforcement, but of men who played at it. One pair belonged to Kyle Baxter, a man whose authority came from a cheap polyester uniform and a title puffed up with importance. Community Compliance Officer. He enjoyed the grip, the slight tremor of resistance before submission. The other pair belonged to Wayne Riggs, a quiet man, a man whose silence was a wall, heavier and more intimidating than any shout. He simply did his job, his face impassive. And watching them was Franklin Prescott. He stood on the perfectly manicured lawn, a few safe feet away, his arms crossed. His smile was thin, almost invisible, a crack in a porcelain mask of civic duty. He was the president of the Serenity Lakes Estates Homeowners Association, the HOA, and on this sunny morning, bathed in the scent of cut grass and blooming azaleas, he believed he was king. He believed he was restoring order. General Eleanor Vance did not struggle. She did not plead or bargain. Hemite. After 30 years of service in the United States Air Force, did not register panic. It was a foreign language she had long forgotten how to speak. It only registered data, processing the scene with a chilling detachment. Threat assessment. 2 hostiles. Physically aggressive. Untrained but enjoying their work. 1 supervising officer, motivated by a deep-seated need for control. A fragile ego polished by petty power. Environment. Her own home, the one place on earth she had chosen for peace. Now, a tactical theater. Witnesses. A few neighbors, their faces pressed against windows like pale ghosts, afraid to intervene, complicit in their silence. Her hands were pulled tight behind her back, the plastic zip tie dug into the thin skin of her wrists, a cheap tool for a cheap display of power. It was then her training took over. Not the training of combat, but of survival. The training of a mind that never sleeps. Fingers, though strained, moved. A subtle motion, masked by the awkward angle. A practice sequence. 3 sharp, deliberate taps against the side of her watch. The device looked simple, a plain, dark gray band, a blank face that told no time. But it was not a normal watch. It was a lifeline, a silent alarm connected to a world Franklin Prescott could not begin to imagine, a world of secure networks and immediate response protocols. Her lips barely moved, a whisper, lost in the rustle of the oak leaves above. Activate Nightfall Contingency. A command, a single sentence, spoken into the void, and with it, a silent clock began to tick somewhere far away. In a room without windows, a countdown that Franklin Prescott, in his moment of absolute triumph, could not hear. But that sound, the dry, final click of the plastic tie cinching tight, that sound had its beginning 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks earlier, there were no plastic cuffs, only the promise of peace. Fragile and new, Eleanor drove her modest sedan through the imposing stone gates of Serenity Lakes Estates. The gates opened slowly, electronically, like a heavy sigh of acceptance. This was it. The final mission, she told herself with a touch of irony. A mission for herself. Retirement. The house was perfect. A single-story brick home, nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It had a large, ancient oak tree in the front yard, its branches like sheltering arms, a porch with a swing. It was more than a house. It was an anchor, a place to finally unpack the boxes she had kept packed for a lifetime. Moving from one base to another, her home, she let the words settle in her mind. A fortress of quiet. The first day, she checked the mailbox. It was a simple, black box at the end of her driveway, standing like a lonely sentinel. Inside, there was no welcome basket from the neighborhood committee. No friendly, handwritten note from a neighbor. Only a single, thick, cream-colored envelope. The logo of the Serenity Lakes HOA was embossed in the corner, formal and severe. Inside was a book. The rules. Thick, heavy, bound in a dark blue vinyl that felt cold to the touch. There was no letter of introduction, no warm welcome, just the book, and a single, separate sheet of paper, printed in a stark, blocky font, a list of fees, maintenance fees, landscaping fees, compliance fees, social fund contributions, numbers on a page, cold, impersonal, an invoice for existing. That night, the book lay on her polished kitchen counter. A silent, watchful guest in her new life, Eleanor, a glass of iced tea in hand, thumbed through the pages. It was a masterwork of micromanagement, rules about the exact height of grass, measured to the quarter-inch, a list of approved colors for front doors, all of them variations of beige, the maximum number of decorative garden gnomes, one gnome, only one, a rule so specific it felt personal. She had read complex rules of engagement, treaties that decided the fates of nations. This book felt heavier, more oppressive. It was a treaty governing the soul, but she was tired of fighting. So tired. The battles she had fought were for things far larger than this. She closed the book with a soft thud. She would comply. She would be a good neighbor. She would be invisible. She would earn her peace. She placed the book on a shelf in the laundry room, tucked away behind the detergent, out of sight. She believed she had found a sanctuary, a place to finally be still. She had forgotten a fundamental rule of strategy, the one she had taught to hundreds of young, eager officers in hushed briefing rooms. Even in the quietest field, the enemy is always watching. The unseen rules. The first weeks at Serenity Lakes were quiet, deceptively so, like the calm surface of a deep, cold lake. Eleanor fell into a gentle rhythm, a stark and welcome contrast to the rigid, siren-driven schedules of her past life. Mornings were for walks, a slow, meditative loop around the largest of the community's placid, man-made lakes. Its surface, a perfect mirror for the wide Virginia sky. She would watch the swans drift by, their movements elegant and unhurried, a living embodiment of the peace she craved. She found a strange, grounding comfort in their predictability. Afternoons were dedicated to the garden. Her late husband, David, a man who loved the earth far more than the confines of an officers' club, had always wanted a rose garden. They had spoken of it often, a dream for a future that never came. Now, she would build one for him, For them, her hands, once accustomed to the smooth wood of briefing room lecterns and the cold steel of classified file cabinets, learned the new, honest language of soil and thorns. Each rosebush she planted was a memory, a tribute, a conversation with a ghost. This quiet, solitary work began to heal something deep within her. The constant, low-level hum of anxiety that had been her companion for 3 decades started to fade into the background. Replaced by the simple satisfaction of nurturing life, she was no longer General Vance, responsible for so much and so many. She was just Ellie, a widow, a gardener, a woman seeking stillness. But the quiet had an edge, a watchfulness. It was a frequency she was trained to detect. She began to notice the white golf cart. It would glide past her house at odd hours, almost silent on its electric motor, a ghost in the periphery. At the wheel was always Franklin Prescott. He never waved. He never stopped to introduce himself. He just observed. His gaze would linger on her property for a moment too long. A slow, methodical scan from the curb to the front door, then to the windows, and back again. She recognized the technique. It was surveillance, plain and simple. A patrol pattern. Then the emails started. They arrived from the official HOA address. Impersonal, authoritative, clinical. The first one was about the wind chimes. A delicate set of bamboo chimes. A gift from a colleague after a joint tour in Japan. Their sound was soft, gentle, woody clinking that reminded her of temple gardens. The email cited Bylaw 17B, Noise Pollution. It declared the chimes a nuisance, a disruption to the community's mandated tranquility. With the patience of a seasoned diplomat negotiating a ceasefire, Eleanor took them down. She chose peace over principle, a small, strategic concession. A week later, another email arrived. This one was about her welcome mat, a simple, dark green mat with the word welcome woven into its fibers. The email stated, without a hint of irony, that its color was not in harmony with the community's approved earth tone palette. It was a violation of the aesthetic code. Again, she complied. She drove to the hardware store and bought a beige one. Bland, acceptable, invisible. She knew this wasn't about chimes or mats. This was testing the perimeter, probing for weakness. To understand the enemy, you must observe their tactics in their own territory. She decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse. A sterile, soulless room with beige walls and rows of uncomfortable chairs. Franklin Prescott sat at the head of a long table, like a king holding court. He was introduced by a fawning board member as the visionary developer who had built this community from the ground up, a guardian of its values. He spoke of those values, of standards, of property values, of harmony. His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man used to being listened to, but Eleanor watched his eyes. She watched how they narrowed when he dismissed a concern from Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman, about a deep crack in the sidewalk. Watch your step, was his only advice. She watched how he cut off Mr. Martinez, a quiet man who tried to ask about the rusty swing set in the playground being unsafe for his children. Prescott told him, with a condescending smile that never reached his eyes, that children should be more careful and perhaps less boisterous. He wasn't a leader. He was a dictator of a tiny, perfectly manicured kingdom. The rulebook wasn't for the community's benefit. It was his weapon, a tool to enforce his singular vision of perfection, a vision that, she was beginning to suspect, had no room for anyone who was different, who didn't fit his unspoken mold. That night, she sat at her desk and started a new file on her computer, a private, encrypted folder labeled HOA Intel. She began to log every email, saving them as PDF files. Every drive-by from the golf cart, noting the time and date, She started taking pictures during her morning walks. The unapproved satellite dish on the roof of the house 2 doors down, the bright pink flamingos defiantly planted in the garden across the street, the boat trailer parked in a driveway overnight, all belonging to white neighbors. All clear violations that went unnoticed, unpunished. She was no longer just a gardener. She was an intelligence officer again, operating behind enemy lines. She was mapping the terrain, assessing the threat. She was building a case. Meticulously, patiently, Prescott thought he was tightening a net around her, slowly squeezing her into submission. He had no idea that for General Vance, every one of his petty, targeted actions was just another piece of data, another entry in a file. And she was getting very close to having all the data she needed to make a decision. The line is crossed. The simmering tension, held in check by Eleanor's strategic compliance, needed only a small spark to ignite into open conflict. Franklin Prescott, a man accustomed to immediate and fearful obedience, grew increasingly frustrated with her quiet Wanada. Methodical adherence to his rules. It felt like defiance to him, a silent mockery of his power. She was following the letter of his law, but her spirit remained unbent. He needed a public display of his authority. He needed to put her in her place. Once and for all, his opportunity arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, in the form of a large, slightly battered-looking truck. The words Veterans Support Network were painted on its side. The lettering faded by the sun. The truck belonged to a charity close to Eleanor's heart, an organization that helped furnish homes for homeless veterans. She had spent the week clearing out her garage, finally unpacking the last of David's things. Setting aside sturdy furniture and household goods she no longer needed for someone who did. The driver, a young man with a prosthetic leg and a shy, grateful smile, reminded her of so many young airmen she had once commanded. The truck parked on the street in front of her house. It was wider than a normal car, and the process of loading a heavy oak dresser was slow and careful. It was there for more than the 15 minutes stipulated by the HOA for parked vehicles. Arule, a violation, a perfect pretext. Like a predator drawn to the scent of blood, Prescott appeared, his white golf cart whirred to a stop directly behind the truck. Blocking it in, Kyle Baxter and Wayne Riggs were with him, his 2 loyal enforcers, their expressions grim. Prescott disembarked from his chariot, his face a mask of manufactured indignation. He approached the young driver, his voice loud, performative, designed to carry across the quiet street to the listening windows. He spoke of fines, of towing. He demanded to see the driver's permit for conducting commercial activity in a residential zone. The young veteran was flustered, confused. His smile vanished. He tried to explain that it was a donation pickup, not a commercial job. He gestured toward Eleanor, who was standing in her open garage. That's when Eleanor moved. She walked calmly to the edge of her driveway. She did not raise her voice. She did not engage in a debate. She simply addressed Prescott with the cool precision of a legal officer. She informed him that, according to Section 4, Paragraph C of the very rulebook he held so dear, charitable and non-profit vehicles engaged in donation pickups were explicitly exempt from the 15-minute parking limit. She had read the fine print. Silence. A thick, heavy silence. The young driver looked at her with a mixture of awe and relief. Baxter and Riggs looked at Prescott, their certainty wavering, waiting for their cue. Prescott's face, which had been flush with power, slowly turned a dark plazindadago. Blotchy red. Humiliation. He had been challenged, corrected, and in public, in front of his men, by her, the woman who refused to be intimidated. He took a step toward her, his body rigid with fury. He pointed a trembling finger, jabbing the air just inches from her face. His voice dropped to a low, menacing growl. the polished veneer of the community leader stripped away to reveal the bully beneath. You may have given orders somewhere else. Lady, but here I give the orders. You will learn to comply, or I will make you leave. The threat hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. It was no longer about rules. It was raw, personal. A line had been crossed. The young driver, forgotten, quickly finished loading with his partner and drove away. Eager to escape the toxic atmosphere, Eleanor simply stood there, her expression unreadable, until Prescott and his entourage departed in their silent cart, leaving a wake of malice behind them. That night, sleep would not come. The quiet of her house felt different, violated, tainted. She walked into her home office, a room she had barely used until now. On a shelf, in a polished wooden box, were her medals. The Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, symbols of a life spent in service. In defense of the very freedoms Franklin Prescott sought to crush under the weight of his petty tyranny, she ran a finger over the cool, familiar metal. The weariness she had felt for months was gone, burned away. In its place, something else was stirring. A familiar fire, a cold, clear, and absolute resolve. She remembered a tense standoff in a foreign country years ago. A volatile situation with lives on the line that required not force, but strategy, patience, and an unwavering will. She had de-escalated it. She had won. Prescott had made a classic. Fatal mistake. He had underestimated his opponent. He did not know that his declaration of war had just been accepted. Franklin Prescott has crossed the final line, but what will he face when a general decides it's time to act? We'd love to hear your predictions in the comments below. If General Vance's story appeals to you, please like and subscribe to join us for the final showdown. The click of the cuffs. The morning of the confrontation was beautiful. A cruel irony. A clear, deep blue Virginia sky stretched overhead. The air was warm, smelling of fresh dew and blooming gardenias, promising a perfect day. Eleanor sat on her front porch swing, a thick book of history open in her lap. She was not reading. The words were a meaningless blur. She was waiting. Her posture was relaxed. Her breathing even. An outward display of calm that concealed a mind operating at peak efficiency. Beside her on a small table sat her laptop. Closed. It was the cheese in the trap. The bait. She did not have to wait long. At precisely 9:37 a.m., her internal clock as reliable as any watch, the white golf cart appeared at the end of the cul-de-sac. It approached slowly, deliberately, its silence more menacing than a roar, a shark gliding through calm, sunlit waters. Prescott was at the wheel. Baxter and Riggs sat beside him, their faces set and serious. They were on patrol. They were on a mission. Prescott stopped the cart on the street, directly in front of her walkway. A strategic position. The three men got out. They walked up her driveway not as neighbors, but as a unit. Their steps synchronized. A small, pathetic show of force intended to intimidate. Prescott stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, positioning himself as the clear commander. He did not greet her. He gestured with his chin toward the laptop, home-based business operations. It declared, his voice ringing with a false, booming authority. A clear violation of Bylaw 26. We have received complaints. We need to inspect the premises to ensure compliance. This was it. The final, clumsy move in his foolish game of chess. Eleanor slowly closed her book, marking her page with a finger, and placed it on the swing beside her. She looked directly at him, her gaze level and unwavering. Her voice was calm, devoid of heat or fear. It was the voice she used in briefings, the one that sliced through nonsense and left no room for argument. You have no authority here. Frank, the use of his first name, so casual, so utterly dismissive, struck him like a physical blow. It stripped him of his title, of his self-importance, of the power he craved. It was a direct challenge to his entire identity within this small kingdom. His face tightened. The mask of civility fell away completely, revealing the raw rage beneath. "That's President Prescott to you," he hissed, his voice venomous. He threw a glance at his men. A curt nod, a silent command. "Get her inside." It happened quickly, but for Eleanor, time seemed to stretch, to slow down. She saw it all with the preternatural clarity of a pilot in a high G turn. Baxter moved up the steps to her right, his bulk blocking the sun. Riggs moved to her left, a silent shadow. They were flanking her, just as she knew they would. She saw the way Baxter's hand reached for her arm, the muscles in his forearm tensing. She saw the way Riggs positioned himself to cut off any path of retreat. She did not resist. Resistance was futile, unnecessary, and not part of the mission parameters. This was part of the plan. Her mind became a command center, a sterile, internal monologue. The voice of pure logic. Assess situation. 2 hostiles. Gnaw visible weapons. Moving to engage. Hostility level high. Their objective humiliation and physical intimidation, leading to unlawful entry. My objective gather irrefutable. Physical evidence of assault and unlawful restraint. And activate high-level response. As Baxter's thick fingers closed around her bicep, she allowed her body to go slightly limp, feigning surprise and fear. The motion was a calculated deception, allowing her to bring her other hand close to her watch without appearing to do so. As they pulled her unceremoniously to her feet and twisted her arms behind her back with practiced roughness, she completed the sequence. 3 sharp taps against the cool metal side. The silent command was sent. Prescott watched, his arms crossed, a look of grim, absolute satisfaction on his face. He had won. He had finally broken her. The defiant general was now just a powerless old woman. He was catastrophically wrong. She heard the rustle of plastic as Baxter fumbled with the zip tie. She felt the cold, serrated edge loop around her wrists. And then she heard the sound, a sound she would never forget. A dry, sharp, definitive click. The sound of the plastic teeth locking together, irrevocably. The sound of a trap being sprung. It echoed in the bright morning quiet. To Franklin Prescott, it was the sound of victory, the final note in his symphony of control. But 30 miles away, deep inside the secure corridors of the Pentagon, another sound had just been heard, a piercing digital alarm that no one ever wants to hear, a sound that set in motion a chain of events that could not be stopped. The Nightfall Contingency had been activated. Nightfall Contingency. Deep inside the Pentagon, in a windowless room known as the National Military Command Center, the air is always cold, always still. It is a place of quiet, vigilant waiting. An airman first class, barely 20 years old, was monitoring a global threat matrix. His screen a calm sea of green and blue data points. Then it happened. A single icon on his display flashed crimson, an audible alarm, low and urgent, echoed through the hushed space. It was an alert he had only ever seen in simulations, an alert that made the blood run cold. Nightfall Contingency. I repeat, we have a Nightfall Contingency. Heads snapped up. Phones were lifted. Senior officers moved with a calm, practiced urgency. The system was designed for precision, not panics. Within seconds, the signal was traced, not to a war zone in some distant country, not to a compromised embassy, but to a quiet cul-de-sac in a gated community in suburban Virginia. An asset was compromised, and the clock was running. Back at Serenity Lakes, Franklin Prescott was savoring his victory. He instructed Kyle Baxter, with a magnanimous wave of his hand, to call the local sheriff's department. "Tell them we have a trespasser in custody," he said, the words rolling off his tongue with relish. "An unstable individual." Baxter made the call. They waited. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. The neighbors were still watching from their windows. Eleanor remained on her knees on the porch. Her expression unreadable. Her posture still impossibly straight despite the bonds. Then they heard the sirens, but the sound was wrong. It wasn't the single, familiar yelp of a county patrol car. It was multiple sirens, converging, growing louder with alarming speed. It was a sound of overwhelming force. The first vehicle, a black, unmarked sport utility vehicle, screamed past the community's unmanned security gate, the barrier arms snapping like a twig. 3 more followed in perfect, disciplined formation. They did not slow down. They swarmed the cul-de-sac, their tires screeching on the asphalt as they formed a perfect, impenetrable perimeter around Eleanor's house. Doors flew open. A dozen agents, clad in black tactical gear with the words DCIS, Federal Agent, emblazoned in bold white letters across their chests, emerged from the vehicles. They moved with a fluid, lethal grace, their weapons held in a low, ready position. They ignored Prescott, Baxter, and Riggs as if they were garden gnomes. Just then, a lone county sheriff's car finally arrived, its single blue light flashing almost apologetically. A deputy, looking confused and out of his depth, stepped out. He saw the federal agents, the subdued woman on the porch, and Prescott, who was puffing out his chest, ready to take command. The lead federal agent, a tall man with a face like carved granite and cold, intelligent eyes, walked directly toward the scene. This was Special Agent Mark Hansen. He bypassed Prescott completely and addressed the local deputy. "We're taking over." "Deputy," he said, his voice flat and absolute. There was no room for discussion. Hansen then turned his full attention to Eleanor. He walked up the porch steps, his movements respectful. He knelt on one knee so he was at her eye level. The entire neighborhood, and a very confused Franklin Prescott, watched in stunned silence. "General Vance," Hansen said, his voice clear and resonant. "Are you secure, General?" The word dropped into the quiet morning like a bomb. It detonated in Franklin Prescott's mind, shattering his entire reality. His jaw went slack. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly white. Baxter and Riggs exchanged a panicked glance. "General," Prescott stammered, the word a weak puff of air. Hansen didn't even look at him. He pulled a small, sharp cutting tool from his vest. With one quick, efficient motion, he sliced through the plastic zip tie. Eleanor's hands were free. Hansen gently helped her to her feet. Then, and only then, did he turn to face the HOA president. He nodded to 2 of his agents. They moved toward Prescott, their steps deliberate. One of them pulled out a pair of steel handcuffs. They gleamed in the morning sun. Franklin Prescott had been arrested, but for General Vance, this was not the end. This was only phase 1. The real fight, the one to ensure this could never happen to anyone else, had only just begun. The Aftershocks. In the immediate aftermath, Eleanor's quiet brick home was transformed into a federal command post. The cul-de-sac remained locked down, the black sport utility vehicles standing guard like silent, imposing beasts. Inside, the atmosphere was one of controlled, professional chaos. Special Agent Mark Hansen and his team worked with quiet efficiency, their voices low and measured. While some agents canvassed the neighborhood, their presence alone enough to compel the previously silent neighbors to speak. Hansen sat with Eleanor in her living room, The room was filled with unpacked boxes and the scent of old books. He had handed her a glass of water. His gesture simple and human. This was not an interrogation. It was a debriefing. A report from the system she had activated. Nightfall doesn't just send us... General. Hansen explained. His tone, respectful but direct. It automatically flags the incident at the highest levels. The Department of Justice has been notified. The JAG Corps is already assembling a legal team. This is no longer an HOA matter. It's a federal case. He confirmed what she already suspected. Prescott, Baxter, and Riggs were not facing a simple trespassing charge. They were facing a slate of federal offenses: conspiracy to deprive a citizen of their rights under color of law, assault on a federal officer, retired or not, unlawful detainment. The list was long. The consequences were severe. For the first time since the ordeal began, Eleanor allowed the mask of command to slip. She let out a long, slow breath. It was a sound of profound weariness. She didn't speak of anger. She spoke of a deep, aching sadness. A sadness that such ugliness could fester and grow in a place named Serenity Lakes, a place people came to escape the harshness of the world. He thought he was the law, she said. Her voice quiet, and for too long, for too many people here. He was, across the street, inside their own living room. Carlos and Maria Martinez watched through their blinds. They had lived in Serenity Lakes for 5 years, always feeling like guests in their own home. They had endured Prescott's constant, low-level harassment, complaints about their children's laughter being too loud, notices about the spices they used for grilling smelling unfamiliar. They had stayed quiet, afraid to make waves, afraid of the power the HOA wielded. They had seen the entire incident unfold. They watched as the federal agents arrived. They saw Franklin Prescott, the man who had made them feel so small, being led away in handcuffs. And for the first time in a very long time, as they looked at the calm, dignified woman being treated with such respect across the street, they felt a flicker of something they had long suppressed. Hope. I'm going to talk to them, Carlos said to his wife, his voice firm. I am going to tell them everything. In a separate, unmarked vehicle parked down the street. The dynamic between the other two men was collapsing. Kyle Baxter, the enforcer who enjoyed his role, was now a sweating, stammering mess. He was blaming everything on Prescott. He told us to do it, he repeated, over and over. We were just following the HOA rules. Wayne Riggs, the silent one, was still silent. He simply stared ahead, his face a blank wall. When an agent finally asked him why he did it, he gave a one-sentence answer that was perhaps the most chilling confession of all. I was just doing my job. The immediate storm had passed. The agents eventually departed, leaving a single car to stand watch. Eleanor's home was quiet once more. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of sanctuary. It was the silence before the next battle. Eleanor knew that the news of this incident would soon break beyond the stone gates of Serenity Lakes, and the media storm to come would be a different kind of war altogether. A nation's echo. The story did not leak. It exploded. An anonymous tip from a shaken local deputy to a reporter at a Washington, D.C. news affiliate was all it took. The initial headline was sensational, almost unbelievable. Retired Air Force general handcuffed by HOA president in suburban dispute. By noon, it was a regional story. By 3 p.m., it was breaking news on national cable networks. By sundown, Serenity Lakes Estates, once an anonymous bastion of upper-middle-class tranquility, was the most infamous neighborhood in America. Eleanor watched it unfold from the quiet of her living room. Her phone silenced to stop the incessant buzzing of calls from reporters, old colleagues, and curious relatives. The television screen became a window into a national conversation she had inadvertently started. Pundit debated. Legal experts analyzed. Talk show hosts feigned outrage. Her face, a stern-looking official military portrait pulled from the archives, was everywhere. The narrative quickly split into predictable camps. Many saw it as a righteous tale of comeuppance, a satisfying story of a petty tyrant finally facing a power greater than his own. Hashtags like General Vance and HOA Overreach trended on social media. People shared their own horror stories of overzealous neighborhood associations, a small but vocal minority, however, tried to spin a different tale. They painted Prescott as a victim, a community leader just trying to enforce the rules, who had the misfortune of crossing a powerful figure from the deep state. They argued she had used a military sledgehammer to crack a neighborhood nut. Eleanor listened to it all with a strategist's detachment. She was not interested in what they said about her. She was assessing the national mood. She was analyzing the battlefield of public opinion. Her old life reached out to her. A 4-star general she had served under, a man known for his gruff demeanor, called her personal line. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer sympathy. He simply said, in his gravelly voice, "Good work, Ellie." About time someone put one of those little Napoleons in his place. It was the highest praise he could offer, and it meant more to her than 1,000 fawning news reports. But what resonated most deeply was a story that emerged a day later. Atenesu's local reporter, refusing to just rehash the national headlines, had knocked on doors in Serenity Lakes. It found Carlos Martinez, and Carlos talked. He told the reporter about the years of quiet intimidation, the notices, the glares, the feeling of being constantly watched and judged. The story, published in a local paper and quickly picked up by the wire services, changed the entire conversation. It proved this was not a one-time incident, not a simple misunderstanding between two stubborn people. It was a pattern, a history of abuse of power, targeting those Prescott deemed unworthy. The story was no longer just about a general. It was about the Martinez family. It was about anyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong in their own home. Eleanor sat in the evening quiet and switched off the television. The noise from the outside world faded away. She had seen enough. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict, but she knew the only verdict that truly mattered was still to come. She knew what her next move had to be. Eleanor's story is no longer her own. It has become a voice for the silent. The truth is slowly coming to light, but the legal battle and the final consequences are still ahead. If you are still listening, please help me by commenting the number 1 below, so I know that I still have friends journeying with me through this story. Your presence is the greatest encouragement for me to continue to the final part, to see what true justice looks like. Thank you. The Price of Hubris. The federal courtroom was a cold, impersonal space. All dark, polished wood and muted. Indirect lighting that seemed to absorb sound. It was a world away from the sun-drenched, manicured lawns of Serenity Lakes, a place of manufactured harmony. This room was a place of stark, unyielding truth. It was here that the final battle would be fought. Not with force, but with facts. Franklin Prescott sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller and grayer than Eleanor remembered. The expensive, tailored suit he wore, once a symbol of his status, now hung on him awkwardly, like a costume for a part he could no longer play. His confidence, the booming, unshakable certainty that had defined him, had been replaced by a sour, defensive arrogance. His high-priced legal team, a trio of slick, confident men, tried to spin a narrative, a story of a dedicated community leader, a volunteer, a man just trying to enforce the rules that everyone had willingly agreed to upon buying their homes. They painted him as the victim, a victim of a simple misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion, a victim of an overzealous federal government. In their telling, General Vance was not a citizen seeking peace, but a powerful, connected figure from the deep state who had used a military sledgehammer to crack a simple neighborhood nut. But their narrative, carefully constructed as it was, began to crumble under the relentless weight of truth. The federal prosecutors were methodical, precise, and unimpressed. They didn't focus on the drama of the final confrontation. They focused on the pattern. They presented the findings of the FBI investigation, a quiet inquiry that had begun the moment Nightfall Contingency was activated, a history of selective enforcement, laid out in spreadsheets and charts that were projected onto a large screen for the jury to see, dozens of warnings, fines, and liens issued to minority families for the most trivial of infractions, the color of a welcome mat, the laughter of children, the scent of unfamiliar spices from a grill. Meanwhile, similar or worse infractions by white homeowners, unapproved satellite dishes, peeling paint. Commercial vehicles parked overnight were systematically ignored. The prosecutors showed financial records, subpoenaed from the HOA's accounts, that suggested Prescott had used community funds for personal travel and lavish dinners, disguised as board meetings and research trips. Then Carlos Martinez took the stand. He was not a polished speaker. He was a master mechanic, a father of 3. He wore a simple, clean suit that he had bought for his daughter's confirmation. It spoke in a quiet, steady voice. But his words, honest and unadorned, filled the silent courtroom with a profound gravity. He didn't speak of bylaws or regulations. He spoke of how it felt to have his children's joyous laughter labeled a nuisance in a formal letter, how it felt to be watched with suspicion every time he had a family barbecue in his own backyard, how it felt to be treated like an unwelcome guest, an outsider, in his own home, a home he worked 60 hours a week at his garage to afford. He spoke for all the families who had been silenced by fear, who had chosen to endure the quiet humiliation rather than risk the wrath of the king. When he finished, there was a profound, respectful silence. The jury, a collection of ordinary citizens, looked at him, and they understood completely. Finally, Eleanor was called to testify. She walked to the stand with a calm, deliberate grace that commanded the room's attention. She wore a simple, dark blue suit, no medals, no uniform. She was just a citizen. She had told the prosecutor, and she would testify as one. The prosecutor led her through the events of that Saturday morning. Her voice was even, factual, and devoid of emotion. She recounted the events, not as a victim seeking pity, but as a senior officer delivering a critical after-action report. She was a strategist, detailing a series of tactical errors made by an opposing force, a force driven by ego and prejudice rather than logic. The defense attorney, a man known for his aggressive style, tried to rattle her on cross-examination. He tried to paint her as arrogant, as a powerful military figure who thought she was above the rules of a simple civilian community. "So you admit you had a laptop on your porch?" "General," he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "I admit I had a laptop on a table on my porch." "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "And you knew that Bylaw 26 of the HOA you agreed to join prohibits home-based business operations." "I also know," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the room with the quiet authority of a lifetime of command, "that reading a history book is not a business operation. And even if it were, the HOA's own governing documents, which I have read thoroughly, do not grant its president the authority to physically assault and unlawfully detain a resident on their own property. That authority belongs to law enforcement. With due process." Her final statement to the prosecutor was the blow from which Prescott's defense could not recover. She turned her gaze slightly, addressing not just the prosecutor, but the jury. This was never about a wind chime, or a welcome mat, or a laptop. Those were just pretexts. This was about a man who believed he had the absolute right to decide who belonged in his community and who did not. He used the rulebook not as a guide for civil living, but as a weapon to enforce his own prejudices and maintain his own power. The laws of the United States, the civil rights that protect every citizen, cannot and should not stop at a gated community's entrance. The verdict, when it came a day later, was swift and unanimous. Guilty on all federal charges, including conspiracy to violate civil rights. Franklin Prescott slumped in his chair as if his strings had been cut. A broken man. The king of Serenity Lakes had lost his kingdom. Kyle Baxter and Wayne Riggs, having testified against their former boss in a plea agreement, received multiple years of probation and a permanent federal ban from ever working in any security or law enforcement capacity again. The consequences rippled outwards. The Serenity Lakes HOA was placed under federal receivership. Its board immediately dissolved. A court-ordered audit began, and a substantial fund was established from the HOA's assets to compensate the families, like the Martinezes, who had been systematically targeted for years. Justice, on paper, had been served. As Eleanor left the courthouse, she was met by a barrage of reporters. Cameras flashed like lightning. Microphones were thrust in her face. But she said nothing. She walked through the storm with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. Her lawyer gently clearing a path. She had said everything that needed to be said in the one room where it truly mattered. The war was over. But Eleanor knew the final, and perhaps most difficult, battle was yet to come. The battle to heal a broken community and to restore meaning to the simple, forgotten word, neighbor. Planting new seeds. Months passed. The chill of autumn gave way to the quiet slumber of winter, and then, slowly, to the tentative warmth of spring. Change came to Serenity Lakes. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, steady persistence, like the green shoots pushing up through the cold earth. The federally appointed oversight committee dissolved the old labyrinthine rulebook. In its place, a new, simpler charter was drafted. Based on principles of mutual respect and common sense, the reign of beige was over. The first sign of the new era was a bright yellow front door that appeared on the Gables house. A cheerful defiance against the years of enforced conformity. Eleanor was invited to speak at the first official community meeting under the new charter. The clubhouse, once a place of tension and fear, was filled with neighbors who were talking to each other. Not at each other. When Eleanor stood at the podium, a hush fell over the room. They expected a speech about her ordeal, about her victory. She gave them something else. She didn't speak of the past. She spoke of the future. She didn't speak about rules. She spoke about respect. A community is not a collection of houses, she said, her voice warm and clear. It's a collection of people. It's not built on bylaws, but on bridges of understanding, of empathy, of simple kindness. She proposed the formation of a new RP, truly representative community council, one where every voice had a seat at the table. After the meeting, Carlos Martinez approached her. He was smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile. He extended his hand. "Thank you, General," he said. "Please," she replied, taking his hand. "Call me Ellie." For the first time, they spoke not as symbols, but as neighbors. The story ends not in a courtroom, but in a garden. A few weeks later, on a bright Saturday afternoon, Eleanor was in her front yard, tending to her roses, which were now bursting with crimson and white blooms. She was not alone. Maria Martinez was there with her, a trowel in her hand, showing Eleanor a trick her grandmother had taught her for dealing with aphids. They worked side by side, their conversation easy and comfortable, their laughter mingling with the birdsong. Carlos was there too, helping his son fix a bicycle chain. Down the street, the Gables were painting their mailbox a vibrant shade of blue. The sound of children's laughter, clear and unapologetic, drifted over from the newly repaired playground. Before Maria left, Eleanor walked to her porch. She retrieved a small box. Inside were the bamboo wind chimes. She hung them from the same hook they had occupied before. As a gentle breeze stirred, they began to chime. A soft, woody, peaceful sound. It was no longer the sound of defiance. It was no longer a violation. It was just music. Eleanor sat on her porch swing, a glass of iced tea in hand. She watched her neighbors. She listened to the chimes. She felt the warmth of the sun on her face. A sense of profound peace settled over her. A peace far deeper than the mere absence of conflict. It was a peace she had fought for. A peace she had helped to build. She was home. Truly home. General Anita Shaw's journey through Serenity Lakes teaches us that even in the quietest corners, injustice can lurk. But it also shows us the profound impact one person's integrity can have. She didn't fight with anger, she fought with truth, turning a moment of humiliation into a movement for accountability. It's a powerful reminder to never underestimate anyone, and to always question those who wield petty power. What thoughts did this story stir in you? I'd genuinely love to read your perspectives in the comments below. If you appreciated this journey with us, please consider subscribing to Dipu Kader Stories. Your support makes all the difference. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being a part of our shared story.